Right now, at this very moment, somewhere between Tehran and Tel Aviv, between the Pentagon and a mountain bunker buried so deep underground that no ordinary bomb can reach it, the world is inching towards something that nobody wants, and almost nobody can stop. This is not a movie. This is not a drill. This is the real story of how three nations, three civilizations, three sets of wounds that never fully healed, ended up standing on the edge of a fire that could consume all of them and take the rest of us with it. In this video, you are going to understand something that most people who argue about this on the internet have never actually understood. You are going to see the full picture, not just the headlines, not just the talking points, but the real, layered, heartbreaking, infuriating, and sometimes almost poetic story of how we got here. You are going to meet the ghosts that haunt every negotiation. You are going to understand why diplomacy keeps failing. You are going to hear the voices of the ordinary people in Tehran, in Tel Aviv, in the refugee camps and the rooftop apartments, who are watching the sky with a dread they cannot name but cannot shake. And at the end, you are going to sit with a question that has no easy answer. Is there still a road out, or have we already passed the last exit? If this is the kind of deep, serious storytelling that you want more of, the kind that actually helps you understand the world instead of just making you angry about it, subscribe to this channel right now, hit the bell, because we do this again and again, and you do not want to miss it. Now, let's go back, not years, decades, because you cannot understand today without understanding a night in 1953 that most Americans have forgotten, but that every single Iranian carries in their bloodstream, like a wound that never fully healed. Mohammad Mossadegh was the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran. Say that again slowly. Democratically elected. He was a lawyer, a nationalist, a man with wire-rimmed glasses, and a gentle voice who believed something radical and dangerous, that Iran's oil belonged to the Iranian people, not to Britain, not to an empire that had been pumping Iranian oil for decades while ordinary Iranians struggled, to the people of Iran. And so he moved to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. He moved to take back what he believed was his country's birthright. The British were furious, the Americans were nervous, and so the CIA, in partnership with British intelligence, did something that would poison everything that came after it. They orchestrated a coup. They called it Operation Ajax. They bribed military officers. They hired thugs to stage street violence. They manipulated the situation from the inside, until Mossadegh was dragged from power, arrested, and replaced by a king, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who would be friendly to the West, who would keep the oil flowing, and who would rule Iran with an increasingly iron fist for the next 26 years. Now here is what you need to understand about that moment. When Americans think about Iran, they think about 1979, they think about hostages, they think about the Ayatollahs and the angry crowds and the burning flags. But Iranians, when they think about America, think about 1953. They think about the day a foreign government reached into their country, grabbed their democracy by the throat, and strangled it. That wound is not ancient history to them. It is alive, it is present, it shapes everything, every negotiation, every accusation of bad faith. Every time an Iranian official says America cannot be trusted, they are not just making a political argument. They are pointing at 1953 and saying, we have proof. The Shah, the king that America installed and supported, modernized Iran in certain ways. He built highways and universities. He tried to drag this ancient civilization into the 20th century on a timetable that served American interests more than Iranian ones. But he also built Savak, and Savak is one of the darkest words in modern Iranian memory. The secret police, a brutal machine of surveillance and torture that crushed dissent with ruthless efficiency. Intellectuals disappeared. Religious leaders were persecuted. People who spoke against the regime were broken, silenced, erased, and through all of it, the United States smiled and nodded and sold weapons and shook hands and called the Shah a great ally and a pillar of stability. When Iranians look at America and see a country that talks about democracy while supporting tyrants, they are not being paranoid. They are being historically accurate. And then came 1979, and when it came like a flood. The Islamic Revolution was not simply a change of government. It was a civilizational rupture, a tidal wave of suppressed rage and religious fervor and wounded national pride that swept everything before it. The Shah fled. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a fierce elderly cleric who had been living in exile in Paris, stepped onto Iranian soil to the roar of millions of people who believed, with absolute conviction, that the long nightmare was over and a new era was beginning. What came next was not the democratic paradise that some of the revolution's supporters had hoped for. It was the Islamic Republic. And the Islamic Republic had from its very first breath two enemies written into its founding DNA: American imperialism and Zionism, the Great Satan and the Little Satan. And those two enemies have defined Iranian foreign policy ever since. When student revolutionaries stormed the American embassy in Tehran in November 1979 and took 52 diplomats and citizens hostage and held them for 444 days, the rupture became permanent. The two nations have had no formal diplomatic relations since. Think about that. Since 1979, that is longer than many of the people watching this video have been alive. And in that absence, in that void where normal communication and diplomacy should have been, the worst possible dynamics filled the space: suspicion, demonization, proxy warfare, Cold War that kept threatening to go hot. The hostage crisis did something else that is important to understand. It branded Iran in the American imagination in a way that has never fully faded: a nation of fanatics, a nation of hostage-takers, a nation that could not be reasoned with. That image, simplified and flattened and stripped of all context, has governed American foreign policy toward Iran for nearly half a century, and that image has made diplomacy almost impossible, because the domestic political cost in America of appearing soft on Iran is enormous. You cannot run for office in the United States and be seen as being nice to Iran. The politics will destroy you, and so the space for compromise has always been narrow and always under threat. But here is something that does not get talked about enough. Right after the hostage crisis, something even more catastrophic happened. Something that shaped Iran's entire strategic worldview in ways that still reverberate today. The Iran-Iraq War began in 1980. Saddam Hussein, watching Iran in the chaotic aftermath of its revolution, saw an opportunity. He invaded, and what followed was 8 years of industrial-scale slaughter that left more than 1 million people dead. Chemical weapons were used on Iranian soldiers, children were sent into minefields, cities were bombed, and throughout all of it, the United States, afraid of Iranian revolutionary power spreading across the region, quietly supported Saddam Hussein. American intelligence helped Iraq. American officials turned a blind eye when Saddam used chemical weapons against both Iranian soldiers and Kurdish civilians inside Iraq itself. Iran bled alone. No superpower came to its defense. No international coalition stood beside it. Sit with that for a moment, because the lesson Iran drew from those 8 years is the engine behind everything that has happened since. The lesson was this: the world will let you die. The only nation that can protect Iran is Iran itself. Self-reliance became a doctrine, distrust of the outside world became a founding principle, and the determination never again to be vulnerable, never again to face an existential threat without a real deterrent, became the driving force behind a nuclear program that the world has been trying, and largely failing, to stop ever since. Now let's bring in the third shadow: Israel. Before 1979, Israel and Iran actually had a quiet, semi-cooperative relationship. That surprises people when they hear it for the first time. But it is true. The Shah's Iran was not an ideological enemy of the Jewish state. There were back channels, there was intelligence sharing, there was pragmatic cooperation between two non-Arab states in a region dominated by Arab nationalism. All of that died with the revolution. Khomeini declared Israel an illegitimate entity. He called it a cancerous presence that had to be removed from the body of the Islamic world. The rhetoric was total and uncompromising, and over the decades that followed, the Islamic Republic built an entire infrastructure of hostility, funding Hezbollah in Lebanon, funding Hamas in Gaza, providing weapons and training and money to groups whose explicit purpose was not political leverage or territorial concession, but the destruction of the Israeli state. For Israel, this is not rhetoric. When Iranian-backed Hezbollah fires rockets into northern Israel, Israelis die. When Hamas attacks, Israelis die. When Iran finances Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Israelis die. The proxy war is not a metaphor. It is measured in funerals. It is measured in the silence of families sitting shiver. And underneath all of it, underneath all the rockets and the missiles and the proxy skirmishes, sits the nuclear question. The question that has been the great dark sun around which all of Middle Eastern security has orbited for 2 decades. Here is the nuclear question in its starkest form. Israel is a small country. Its population is concentrated. Its geography is narrow. A single nuclear weapon dropped on Tel Aviv would not merely destroy a city. It could end the Jewish state as a functioning entity. Israeli leaders have said, with total and absolute clarity, that they will not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. They have not said this as a preference or a policy aspiration. They have said it as a red line, as an existential threshold, and red lines, when crossed, do not lead to more negotiations. They lead to war. Iran insists its nuclear program is peaceful. Iranian officials point out, and this is technically accurate, that Iran has signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, while Israel, which is widely believed to possess somewhere between 80 and 90 nuclear warheads, has never signed it. They point out that no American or Israeli official has produced definitive proof of an Iranian decision to build a weapon. The International Atomic Energy Agency has repeatedly found enrichment levels that go far beyond what civilian energy production requires, but has not been able to confirm a weapons program. This ambiguity is deliberate. It is strategic. Iran wants the deterrence benefit of nuclear ambiguity without paying the full price of a nuclear confrontation. It wants to be close enough to the line to be taken seriously as a threat, without being so clearly across it that an attack becomes politically inevitable. But by 2024 and into 2025, that ambiguity was running out. Iranian enrichment had reached 60% purity. Think about what that means in technical terms. 5% is what you need for civilian energy production. 90% is weapons grade. 60% is not a civilian program. 60% is a message. It is Iran saying, without quite saying it, we are close. We are very close. We could be there in weeks if we chose to be. The breakout timeline, the time between a political decision to build a bomb and actual possession of a nuclear device, had collapsed to almost nothing. American intelligence assessments made this stark and clear. This was not a theoretical concern anymore. This was a strategic emergency, and into this emergency walked the return of maximum pressure. The Trump administration's return to the White House in January 2025 brought a clear and unambiguous philosophy. Iran must give up its nuclear ambitions or face consequences. Sanctions were tightened with renewed ferocity. Iran's oil exports, the oxygen of its economy, were targeted again. The message from Washington was simple. The time for half measures is over, and the consequences being discussed were not merely more economic pressure, they were military. Openly, seriously, credibly military. Now let's stop here for a second and talk about the geography of this crisis, because the geography matters enormously, and it almost never gets explained properly. Iran is not a small country. People hear Iran, and they sometimes picture a city or a region. Iran is a nation of nearly 90 million people. It is as large as Alaska. Its terrain includes deserts and mountains and urban jungles and coastlines. Its military is not the most sophisticated in the world, but it is deeply embedded in its territory, prepared for exactly the scenario of an attack from the air, dispersed across its geography, in ways specifically designed to survive a first strike. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, is not simply a branch of the Iranian military. It is a political force, and an economic empire, and an ideological movement, and the custodian of Iran's most sensitive military capabilities. It controls the missile program. It controls the proxy networks. It controls the nuclear program. It is a state within a state, and its commanders have stated, clearly and repeatedly, that any attack on Iran would trigger simultaneous responses across the entire region. Iran's missile arsenal is the largest and most diverse in the Middle East. Short-range missiles that can hit Israel, medium-range missiles that can hit every American base in the region, a growing inventory of precision-guided munitions that have been steadily transferred to Hezbollah in Lebanon, to Houthi forces in Yemen, to militias in Iraq and Syria. A conflict with Iran would not be a neat contained air campaign with a clear beginning and a clear end. It would be a regional explosion, a chain reaction, a simultaneous ignition across a dozen fronts that no military planner has a clean answer for. Hezbollah alone, let that sink in. Hezbollah, Iran's most capable and most heavily armed proxy, operating from the hills of southern Lebanon, is estimated to possess more than 150,000 rockets and missiles, not the crude, unguided rockets of previous conflicts. Many of them are precision-guided. Many of them have ranges and warheads capable of striking deep into Israel. A full Hezbollah engagement would mean rockets and missiles falling not just on northern Israel but on Tel Aviv, on Ben Gurion Airport, on Israeli military installations, power plants, water infrastructure. It would mean a country of 9 million people fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, while its economy ground to a halt, and its population sheltered underground in a darkness that could last weeks. For the United States, the calculus is different but not simpler. America has bases throughout the region. Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, the UAE, Jordan. These are forward positions of enormous strategic value. They are also in a conflict with Iran. Targets. Iranian missiles can reach every one of them. And then there is the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow choke point, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day. If that strait is blocked or mined, the economic consequences begin immediately and multiply fast. Oil prices spike toward levels that send shockwaves through every economy on Earth. Supply chains disrupt. Inflation surges. A global economy that has already absorbed years of turbulence gets thrown back into crisis. The American military could destroy Iran's air defenses. It could strike its nuclear facilities. It could set the program back by years, but it cannot do so without cost. It cannot do so without triggering consequences that extend far beyond any battlefield. And here is where the story gets human. And I need you to stay with me here, because this is the part that gets lost, the part that the strategic analyses and the policy briefs and the cable news arguments almost never make space for. In Tehran, right now, there are young men and women who have never known anything but the Islamic Republic. They have grown up under sanctions. They have grown up watching their currency collapse, and the Iranian rial has lost a staggering proportion of its value over decades of economic isolation. They have watched their opportunities shrink. They have watched their parents struggle with inflation rates that would be unimaginable to most people watching this video. They have watched their government spend billions of dollars on a nuclear program and on proxy armies across the Middle East, while ordinary Iranian citizens cannot afford meat, cannot afford medicine, cannot afford the basic dignity of a stable life. Many of these young people, millions of them, despise the Islamic Republic. They want it gone, not reformed. Gone. They marched in 2009, the Green Movement, millions of people in the streets demanding accountability after a stolen election. The regime crushed them. They marched again in 2019, after fuel price increases sent shockwaves through already struggling households. The regime killed hundreds of them in a single weekend. Hundreds, in a single weekend, and they marched again in 2022. Woman, life, freedom, after a young Kurdish Iranian woman named Mahsa Amini died in the custody of the morality police, the latest in a long line of women harassed and arrested and killed for the crime of wearing their hair wrong. Those protests spread to cities and towns and villages across the country. Young people cutting their hair in public, burning their headscarves, chanting in Farsi the names of the dead, and the regime crushed them again, with bullets and imprisonment and executions that continued long after the international cameras turned away. These are the people who would pay the highest price in a war, not the supreme leader and his compound, not the IRGC generals insulated by their wealth and power, the teacher in Tabriz who teaches chemistry during the day and reads poetry at night, the medical student in Isfahan who dreams of Canada but cannot get a visa, the grandmother in Mashhad who prays 5 times a day and loves her grandchildren and wants nothing more than to grow old in peace. These are the people who would be buried under the rubble if bombs fell on Iranian cities. These are the people who deserve to be seen, not as subjects of a hostile regime, not as background characters in a geopolitical thriller, but as human beings with lives and loves and futures that matter exactly as much as anyone else's. And in Israel, the human stakes are equally vivid and equally agonizing. To understand Israeli thinking about Iran today, you have to understand October 7th, 2023. And to understand October 7th, you have to understand that for a generation of Israelis, there had been a kind of working assumption, never comfortable, never peaceful, but functional, that deterrence held, that the cycles of violence were terrible but survivable, that Hamas was a threat to be managed, not an existential enemy capable of catastrophic attack. October 7th shattered that assumption into pieces that have not been and may not be reassembled. 1,200 Israelis killed in a single day, the worst mass killing of Jewish people since the Holocaust. Israeli families dragged from their homes as hostages into Gaza. Children murdered at a music festival in the desert where they had gathered to dance, to celebrate, to be young. Kibbutzim, communities built on the dream of peaceful coexistence, on the aspiration of tilling the land and raising children in safety, burned to the ground. The intelligence failure that allowed it to happen was staggering, occurring inside what was supposed to be the most capable military and surveillance apparatus in the region. The sense that no level of preparation, no level of security, no level of deterrence is ever truly enough, that the threat is not just external but structural and permanent, settled into the Israeli national psyche like lead. The Israeli military response in Gaza was devastating in ways that horrified much of the world. But for Israelis who had watched their neighbors and friends dragged as hostages into tunnels, who had watched their children murdered, who had watched their communities incinerated, the response felt like survival, like the only conceivable answer when your back is against the wall and the people attacking you have made their intentions unmistakably clear, and that sense of existential threat, sharpened to a razor's edge by October 7th, is what drives Israeli thinking about Iran today. If Hamas could do what it did on October 7th, with the weapons and training that Iran provided, what could Hezbollah do with its 150,000 rockets? What could Iran do with a nuclear weapon? These are not academic questions for Israelis at 3 in the morning. These are the questions that explain why Israeli leaders have said again and again that they will strike Iran's nuclear program before they allow it to reach a point of no return. And in April and October of 2024, something happened that had never happened before in the history of this decades-long confrontation. Israel and Iran struck each other's territory directly. For the first time, Iran launched more than 300 drones and missiles at Israel in a single night in April. Most were intercepted by Israeli air defenses, by American and British assets, even by Jordanian and Saudi assistance, in a remarkable moment of quiet regional cooperation, driven by a shared fear of Iranian escalation. But some hit. Israel struck back, and both sides chose, for the moment, not to escalate further. The confrontation was contained, but the line had been crossed. The boundary between shadow war and open war had been erased, and crossing it a second time or a third time would be easier. Each crossing makes the next one more normal. Each exchange makes restraint a little harder to maintain. Now let's talk about the United States, because America's role in this crisis is enormous and contradictory, and deeply structurally consequential. America is Israel's closest and most powerful ally. The security relationship runs deep. Intelligence sharing, military cooperation, advanced weapons systems, diplomatic cover at the United Nations when Israel needs it. But America is also the only power on earth that is genuinely capable of restraining Israel when restraint is needed, and American presidents have, at various points over decades, leaned hard on Israeli governments to hold back from military strikes on Iran, to give diplomacy more time, to think about the regional consequences of unilateral action, and they have also, at other points, given something closer to a green light, or at least an amber one. The tension in American policy toward Iran is structural, and is not going away. On one side, there is the unbreakable commitment to Israel's security, an American domestic political reality that crosses party lines and has remained consistent through administrations of both parties. On the other side, there is the exhaustion with Middle Eastern wars, 2 decades of Afghanistan and Iraq, the trillions spent, the lives lost, the outcomes that never matched the promises, the sense, deeply embedded in American politics across the ideological spectrum, of having sacrificed enormous blood and treasure in a region that responded by becoming more unstable, not less. The American public does not want another Middle Eastern war, but the American political system has also committed to preventing Iran from going nuclear and to guaranteeing Israeli security. Those commitments point toward conflict, the exhaustion points away, and between those two forces, American policy oscillates, squeezes, tries to find a third option that will somehow satisfy both demands and usually satisfies neither. Now let's talk about Saudi Arabia, because the Saudi position in this crisis is one of the most significant geopolitical shifts of the last decade, and it almost never gets the attention it deserves. Saudi Arabia and Iran are ancient rivals, Sunni versus Shia Islam, Arab versus Persian, different visions of what the Muslim world should be, who should lead it, what direction it should go. They have been fighting this rivalry through proxies across the region for decades, in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in the theological arguments that shape the politics of Muslim-majority nations from Indonesia to Morocco. For decades, Saudi Arabia and Israel were on opposite sides of the Arab-Israeli divide, unable to openly cooperate, constrained by the domestic politics of a region where public opinion on the Palestinian question made normalization with Israel politically toxic. But the Abraham Accords of 2020, in which the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco normalized relations with Israel, began to crack that picture open. Saudi normalization with Israel was being actively discussed, negotiated, and nearly concluded before October 7th blew the talks apart. The Saudis and the Israelis, despite everything that divides them, share a common fear of Iranian expansionism. They share an interest in containing Iranian power, and a formal alignment between Saudi Arabia and Israel, backed by American security guarantees, would represent one of the most significant realignments of Middle Eastern politics in the modern era. October 7th did not kill that logic, it just buried it under rubble that will take time to clear. And then there is China, because China's brokering of a Saudi-Iranian rapprochement in 2023, a surprise diplomatic move that caught Washington off guard, demonstrated something important. Beijing is playing its own long game in the Middle East, and it is doing so with patience and sophistication that American distraction and political paralysis have made easier. China imports enormous quantities of Iranian oil. China has economic and strategic interests in regional stability that are different from America's, and China has demonstrated that it is willing to use diplomatic tools in the Middle East that America has largely abandoned. This is not a minor subplot. This is a signal about the direction of the world. Let's get into the nuclear deterrence debate, because this is where some of the most serious arguments happen and where some of the most dangerous misconceptions live. The standard deterrence argument goes like this. Nuclear weapons, paradoxically, make war less likely, because no rational actor would risk nuclear retaliation. This was the logic that underpinned Cold War stability between the United States and the Soviet Union, two superpowers pointing thousands of nuclear warheads at each other for decades, and neither using them, because both understood that using them would mean the end of everything. Some analysts apply this logic to Iran. They argue that a nuclear Iran would actually be more stable than a non-nuclear Iran, because Iranian leaders, however extreme their rhetoric, are ultimately rational actors who want to survive, and who would never actually use a nuclear weapon. This argument has been made by serious scholars. It is not stupid, it has a certain cold logic, but Israel rejects it entirely, and the rejection is not irrational. There are at least 3 reasons why nuclear deterrence in the Iranian context is more fragile than it was during the Cold War. First, Iran has repeatedly stated that Israel's destruction is not merely a policy goal, but a religious and ideological imperative. When Iranian leaders have called for Israel to be wiped from the map, they are making statements that, in a nuclear context, cannot simply be waved away as political theatre. Second, Iran's political structure involves competing power centers that create genuine risk of miscalculation. The supreme leader, the IRGC, reformist factions, hardliners. These are not a monolithic command structure. They are competing forces, and the risk of a faction making a decision that escalates beyond anyone's original intention is real. Third, if Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, the proliferation cascade in the Middle East would likely be rapid. Saudi Arabia has already signaled that it would seek its own nuclear capability. If Iran went nuclear, Turkey might follow, Egypt might follow. A Middle East with multiple nuclear-armed states and profound sectarian and territorial tensions is a Middle East where the probability of nuclear use, even accidentally, even as the result of pure miscalculation, reaches levels that should terrify everyone. There is also the question of what Iran would do with nuclear weapons, short of actually using them. This is the scenario that keeps Israeli security officials awake at night. Not necessarily the mushroom cloud over Tel Aviv, though that too, but something more insidious. The permanent entrenchment of Iranian power across the region, underwritten by the ultimate deterrent. A nuclear-armed Iran could support its proxy networks with greater aggression, knowing that any decisive military response would carry the risk of nuclear escalation. Hezbollah fires into Israel, Hamas conducts attacks, Houthi forces block the Red Sea, and behind all of it stands a nuclear Iran, making any attempt to break the cycle unconscionably risky. The nuclear weapon as a shield for proxy warfare. The nuclear weapon not as a last resort, but as a permanent permission structure. The world has watched all of this with a mixture of horror and helplessness that reflects something deeply broken about the international system designed to prevent exactly this kind of crisis. The United Nations Security Council, the body theoretically responsible for international peace and security, is paralyzed. Russia and China both hold veto power. Russia, engaged in its devastating war in Ukraine, and increasingly dependent on Iranian-supplied drones that have been hammering Ukrainian power infrastructure, has every incentive to block any UN action against Tehran. China, importing enormous quantities of Iranian oil, and viewing the destabilization of American allies in the Middle East as strategically beneficial, is equally disinclined to support meaningful pressure. The result is an international community that can issue statements and express concern but cannot act. The machinery designed after World War II to prevent exactly this kind of escalation has been rendered useless by the very great power rivalries it was supposed to manage. History's darkest irony is right there in that fact. European nations, France, Germany, Britain, have tried for years to keep diplomatic channels open. They helped negotiate and implement the JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear deal that actually, verifiably constrained Iran's nuclear program. They watched it collapse when Trump withdrew in 2018. They tried to salvage its remnants. They watched those efforts fail. European diplomats speak now, with a quiet and barely concealed despair, of windows that keep closing, of opportunities that arrive and slip away, of moments when a deal was almost within reach, and then fell apart because of domestic politics in Washington, or ideological rigidity in Tehran, or because some military incident triggered a new cycle of escalation at exactly the wrong moment. The story of the JCPOA is worth sitting with, because it contains one of the most tragic dynamics in this entire decades-long drama. The Obama administration invested enormous political capital in negotiating the nuclear deal. The Iranian team on the other side, led by Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif, backed by President Hassan Rouhani, negotiated in genuine good faith. They represented, within the Iranian political system, the reformist camp, the people who believed that Iran could get sanctions relief, integrate into the global economy, improve the lives of its people, and do all of this without sacrificing Iranian security or dignity. The JCPOA was their proof of concept. It was a deal that constrained Iran's nuclear program in ways that were verifiable and meaningful, in exchange for significant sanctions relief. It was not a perfect deal. No deal in the real world is perfect. But it worked. For the years it was in effect, it worked. Then Donald Trump withdrew from it in 2018, and the consequences of that withdrawal were not simply that the nuclear deal collapsed, they were that the reformist camp inside Iran, the people who had argued that diplomacy with America was possible, that engagement was worth the risk, that Iran could trust an American commitment, was destroyed politically. Their argument had been, engage with the West, compromise on the nuclear program, get economic relief in return. What they got instead was a unilateral American withdrawal that left them with nothing. The lesson that Iranian hardliners drew was the lesson they had always insisted on. America cannot be trusted. Any deal you make with America will be repudiated by the next administration. The only reliable guarantor of Iranian security is Iranian nuclear capability. The withdrawal did not just end a deal, it ended the credibility of the Iranians who had made the case for deals. It strengthened the hand of the very hardliners whose confrontational posture makes military conflict more likely. That is the tragic irony that haunts every conversation about Iran. American actions intended to prevent Iranian nuclear weapons may have made Iranian nuclear weapons more probable, by eliminating domestic Iranian political constituency for diplomacy. Let's talk about Yemen, because the Houthi dimension of this crisis, Iran's proxy war at the southern end of the Red Sea, is one of the most economically consequential and least understood threads of the whole conflict. The Houthis are a Yemeni rebel movement that controls much of northern Yemen, including the capital Sana'a, and that have been attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea since late 2023, framing these attacks as solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza. Their attacks use a combination of drones, anti-ship missiles, and speedboats, and they have forced dozens of major shipping companies to reroute their vessels around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks and enormous cost to global supply chains. The cost of shipping a standard container between Asia and Europe multiplied dramatically. Goods took longer to arrive, insurance costs soared. The global economy absorbed billions of dollars in disruption from an Iranian proxy operating in a war-torn country at the edge of the world, with weapons supplied by Tehran and intelligence provided through the IRGC. American and British military strikes against Houthi targets in Yemen degraded their capabilities at the margins, but did not stop the attacks. The Houthis proved remarkably resilient, partly because of the extraordinary difficulty of the terrain, partly because Iran kept the weapons and intelligence flowing. And the Houthi campaign illustrates a broader truth about Iranian strategy that Western analysts sometimes dangerously underestimate. Iran does not need to win a direct military confrontation with the United States or Israel to achieve its strategic objectives. It needs only to make the status quo expensive enough that its adversaries lose the will to maintain it. Every shipping attack raises global costs. Every Hezbollah rocket costs Israel money and generates political pressure. Every American soldier killed or wounded in an attack by an Iran-backed militia in Iraq or Syria raises the political cost of American regional presence. Death by 1,000 cuts. Cost imposition without crossing the threshold that would trigger a devastating American military response. It is a strategy that has worked for decades, and the men designing it, some of them veterans of the Iran-Iraq War, forged in the crucible of 8 years of industrial slaughter, understand it with absolute clarity. Now let's do something that almost nobody in this debate is willing to do. Let's game out what a real war would actually look like. Not a shadow war, not proxy skirmishes, a direct all-out conflict, because military planners in all three capitals have done exactly this, in exhaustive detail, and the results of those war games are sobering enough that almost nobody who has actually read them wants to fight this war. An Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, the Fordo enrichment plant buried under a mountain, the Natanz facility, the Arak heavy water reactor, the Isfahan conversion facility, would require hundreds of aircraft, precision-guided munitions, aerial refueling capacity, electronic warfare support, and almost certainly significant American assistance to penetrate the most hardened targets. Israel has demonstrated in 2024 that its aircraft can penetrate Iranian airspace. Israel's F-35 stealth fighters could make the journey, but the deeply buried facilities, Fordo in particular, which was built inside a mountain, specifically to survive an air attack, require weapons of a size and penetrating power that Israel does not possess in sufficient quantity. The United States does possess them. The massive ordnance penetrator, a 30,000-pound bunker-buster bomb designed specifically for targets like Fordow, which means that a truly effective strike on Iran's nuclear program requires not just Israeli action but direct American participation. There is no scenario in which Israel does this alone and also succeeds at destroying the program rather than merely setting it back. And then the day after. What happens the day after the bombs fall? Iran retaliates. Hezbollah, which has been holding back its most capable missiles for exactly this moment, conserving the precision-guided munitions for maximum impact, unleashes a barrage designed to overwhelm Israeli air defenses through sheer volume and variety. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis in bomb shelters, Tel Aviv's airport closed, the Iron Dome and David's Sling and Arrow missile defense systems, extraordinary technologies, the best air defenses in the world, cannot intercept everything when 150,000 rockets are potentially in play, launched from multiple directions simultaneously. The mathematics of interception eventually fail. Things get through. Things hit. Iranian ballistic missiles target American bases in the Gulf. The Strait of Hormuz is blocked or mined within hours. American naval assets scramble, but the damage to oil flows begins immediately. Oil prices hit $200 a barrel within days. Stock markets around the world collapse in a cascade of panic selling. Iran-backed militias in Iraq and Syria launch attacks on American personnel throughout the region. The Lebanese economy, already shattered by years of mismanagement and the catastrophic 2020 port explosion, collapses entirely as Beirut becomes a theatre of operations. Syria, already a decade deep in ruin, becomes a killing ground for a dozen different factions pursuing a dozen different agendas in the chaos. The Palestinian population in Gaza, already suffering catastrophically, suffers more. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, in the confusion and the noise and the speed of events unfolding faster than any command structure can process, the risk of miscalculation climbs to levels that make the previously unthinkable genuinely thinkable. An Iranian commander who believes the regime is about to fall, an Israeli official who interprets an incoming missile as a nuclear delivery, a decision made in panic or exhaustion, or the fog of a war that no one planned for and no one fully controls. The logic of the situation pulls toward escalation, even as every rational actor is trying to prevent it. No one wants this war. Read that sentence again. No one wants this war. And yet every decision, every provocation, every sanction and missile test and diplomatic failure and red line drawn and red line crossed has moved the region closer to it with a terrible, grinding momentum. This is not conspiracy. This is not fate. This is the tragedy of rational actors behaving rationally within their own frames of reference, while the collective result of their rationality is potentially catastrophic for everyone. The logic of deterrence demands credible threats. The logic of credibility demands enforced red lines. The logic of enforcement leads, step by grinding step, toward the thing that no one wants. Now, what would diplomacy look like if it were to succeed? It is worth asking this seriously, not as a feel-good exercise but as a hard analytical question, because the answer reveals both the real possibilities and the genuine obstacles in a way that nothing else does. A comprehensive agreement between Iran and the West, call it JCPOA 2.0, or call it something entirely new, would need to accomplish several things. It would need to constrain Iran's nuclear program in ways that are verifiable, permanent, and genuinely limited in what Iran retains. It would need to provide Iran with enough economic relief, sanctions lifted, access to the international banking system restored, frozen assets released, that the deal is actually worth more to Iranian leaders than their nuclear program. This is the core challenge. You have to make the deal so valuable that walking away from it is genuinely costly. It would need to include security guarantees that give Iran confidence that America will not use the cover of a deal to pursue regime change, because regime change is Iran's greatest fear, the fear that underlies its entire strategic posture, and a deal that does not address that fear will not hold. It would need Israeli buy-in, or at least Israeli acquiescence, which is an enormous political challenge given Israeli distrust of any arrangement that does not completely eliminate Iran's nuclear capacity, and it would need to survive American domestic politics. That last requirement may be the hardest of all. Iran deals in America have been reliably destroyed by partisan opposition, regardless of their merits. The JCPOA is the case study. It was a technically sound agreement that verifiably constrained Iran's nuclear program for more than a decade, and it was tossed aside not because it had failed, but because it was politically useful to call it a failure. Any new deal faces the same risk. It will be attacked, demonized, and potentially abandoned by the next administration, and Iranian negotiators know this, which is why they approach any American offer with a suspicion that is, unfortunately, historically earned. This is a very high bar. It may be impossibly high given the current political dynamics, but the alternatives to clearing that bar are worse. The status quo is not stable. Iran's enrichment capabilities grow every month. The breakout timeline shrinks every quarter. The diplomatic window is not merely closing, it may already be closed. What we are watching now may be the final act before military confrontation, or it may be the final moment, the last possible moment, before someone finds the wisdom and the courage to choose a different path. The global dimensions of this crisis extend beyond the Middle East, in ways that are both important and underreported. Russia's relationship with Iran has deepened dramatically since the invasion of Ukraine. Iran has supplied Russia with Shahed drones, the weapon that has devastated Ukrainian power infrastructure, plunged Ukrainian cities into darkness, killed Ukrainian civilians in their homes and hospitals. In return, Russia has been exploring the transfer of advanced military technology to Iran, air defense systems, potentially fighter jets, capabilities that would significantly complicate any Israeli or American strike on Iranian facilities. This relationship transforms the Iran crisis from a regional problem into a component of a global realignment. America's adversaries, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, are finding common strategic cause against American primacy in ways that would have seemed improbable a decade ago. They are not a formal alliance. They are not unified by ideology. They are unified by their shared interest in weakening the American-led order. China buys Iranian oil. Russia uses Iranian drones. North Korea supplies artillery shells that end up in the arsenals of Iranian-backed militias. These threads are not separate. They are woven together. And then there is the energy dimension. The world remains deeply, perhaps fatally, dependent on fossil fuels. A significant portion of those fuels come from or transit through the Persian Gulf. Any sustained disruption, any closure of the Strait of Hormuz, any sustained damage to Saudi or Kuwaiti or Emirati infrastructure would trigger an economic shock of a magnitude not seen since 1973. And 1973, the Arab oil embargo, the gas lines, the inflation spiral, happened in a world economy that was far more resilient than today's, far less interconnected, far less leveraged. Today's global economy runs on credit, on just-in-time supply chains, on a financial architecture where a disruption in one market triggers cascades in markets halfway around the world before anyone can respond. An oil shock of $200 a barrel would not be painful in the ordinary sense of the word. It would be transformative. It would reshape political landscapes in democracies across the world. It would accelerate the already powerful forces of populism and anger that are already remaking Western politics in ways that frighten historians. It would impoverish hundreds of millions of people who are already living on the edge. There is also the climate dimension, which might seem almost absurd to raise in this context, and yet cannot honestly be ignored. Every disruption of oil supplies, every reminder of the catastrophic geopolitical instability that fossil fuel dependency creates, makes the argument for an energy transition more urgent. And yet war in the Middle East, the destruction, the political instability, the consumption of resources and attention that conflict demands, makes that transition harder. History, as always, finds ways to be inconvenient, and there are the voices that never make it into the strategic analyses, the voices that deserve to be heard, and almost never are. A Yemeni child, who has never known a day without the sound of something falling, a Syrian family that fled Aleppo and now lives in a Turkish refugee camp, praying the conflict does not spread and swallow whatever remains of their life, a Lebanese shopkeeper in Beirut, who rebuilt his store after the 2006 war, after the 2020 port explosion, after every catastrophe that has visited his city, and who has run out of the capacity to rebuild again, a Palestinian family in Gaza living in a tent among the ruins of what used to be their neighborhood, watching the political chess game that destroyed their home play out on a cracked phone screen between prayers, a young Iranian woman who cut her hair in public in 2022 as an act of defiance, who lost her job for it, whose best friend was arrested, who has been waiting ever since for anything to change, a Jewish grandmother in Haifa who was born in Morocco and came to Israel as a child, and who has lived through every war since 1967, and who is simply tired, bone tired, of all of it. Who wants to sit on her balcony and watch the Mediterranean and not have to be afraid? These voices do not appear in Security Council deliberations. They do not appear in the briefing rooms at the Pentagon, or the IRGC headquarters, or the Israeli Defense Ministry, but they are the substance of the crisis. They are the reality that statistics erase and strategic language obliterates. Every missile test is someone's nightmare. Every sanctions package is someone's bread. Every diplomatic failure is someone's future. Let's talk about the internal dynamics of Iran one more time, because understanding them is crucial to understanding whether there is any realistic path to a different outcome. The Islamic Republic is not a monolith. It is not a single, unified actor with a single will pointing in a single direction. There are genuine, ongoing debates within the Iranian political system about the nuclear program, about the relationship with the West, about whether the economic costs of confrontation are worth the security benefits they are supposed to provide. The reformist camp represented in recent years by Rouhani, by Zarif, by the generation of technocrats who negotiated the JCPOA, genuinely believed in a different path. They believed Iran could be secure without being isolated, could be respected without being feared, could be part of the international economic order without surrendering its independence or its dignity. They were wrong about whether America would keep its commitments, and paying the price for being wrong about that destroyed their political standing at home. Now the hardliners hold the argument. Now the people who said from the beginning that America cannot be trusted are the ones with the credibility, and the hardliners' answer to the question of Iranian security is the one that the experience of the last several decades, the coup, the Iran-Iraq war, American support for Saddam, the JCPOA collapse, seems to vindicate. The only reliable security is the security you build yourself, with weapons the enemy cannot ignore and cannot neutralize. The role of ordinary people in determining the outcome of all of this is simultaneously the most powerless and the most decisive variable in the equation. Powerless, because the decisions that will determine whether bombs fall are made by a small number of men in closed rooms in capitals where ordinary people have no seat. Decisive, because it is ordinary people who fight wars, who pay the economic costs of sanctions, who absorb the trauma of conflict, who vote politicians in and out of power, who ultimately shape the political environment in which those closed-room decisions get made. In Iran, young people who want a different country are watching this crisis with a kind of paralysis that is almost unbearable. They do not want war. They know, and the history supports this knowledge, that foreign military attack does not liberate repressed populations. It almost always strengthens authoritarian regimes by triggering nationalist unity around the flag. An American or Israeli attack on Iran would almost certainly strengthen the Islamic Republic, at least in the short term, as Iranian citizens rallied against the foreign aggressor, regardless of their feelings about their own government. But they also know that without change, without some break in the cycle, their lives will continue to shrink. They are caught between the violence of the regime that oppresses them and the violence of the adversaries who want to punish the regime and always end up punishing the people instead. In America, the public attention to the Iran crisis waxes and wanes with the news cycle in ways that would be darkly comic if the stakes were not so catastrophic. Americans have been exhausted by 2 decades of Middle Eastern wars, the trillions spent, the thousands of American military lives lost, the hundreds of thousands of foreign lives lost, the outcomes that never match the promises, the speeches, the confident predictions. There is a deep and genuine reluctance in American politics across the ideological spectrum to commit American forces to another Middle Eastern conflict, and yet there is also, embedded in that same politics, an unbreakable commitment to Israel's security and an equally unbreakable determination that Iran will not acquire a nuclear weapon. These commitments are not going away, and they both point, under certain conditions, toward military action. This is the deepest structural tension in American foreign policy right now. Commitments that imply the possibility of conflict, operating within a political environment that has lost its appetite for conflict. During a moment when the adversaries who benefit from American hesitation are testing every boundary they can find, the question of what wisdom would look like in this moment is worth sitting with, not as a pious exercise but as a genuine analytical question. What would it actually take to get from here to somewhere better? It would require acknowledging the legitimate security concerns of all parties, including Iran's, without validating the behavior of a regime that brutalizes its own people and destabilizes the neighborhood. Those two things can be true simultaneously. Iran has real security concerns rooted in real history. The regime that claims to represent those concerns is also genuinely repressive and genuinely destabilizing. Holding both of those truths at once is hard. It requires nuance. It requires resisting the temptation to see every issue as simple. But without that nuance, there is no diplomacy worth the name. It would require a diplomatic framework that addresses not just the nuclear question, but the broader question of regional security architecture. One that gives Iran a legitimate place in the regional order, without allowing Iran to dominate that order through terror and force and proxy armies. Iran's fundamental demand to be respected, to be secure, to not be subject to regime change by external powers, is not unreasonable at its core. The methods Iran has used to pursue those objectives are often terrible, but the objective itself is one that any nation has a right to pursue. A framework that ignores that distinction will fail. It would require American and Israeli restraint in the face of Iranian provocations, combined with deterrence that is credible enough that Iran does not mistake restraint for weakness. That is an extraordinarily difficult balance to strike, especially in a domestic political environment where restraint looks like weakness and confrontation looks like strength. But leaders who are willing to pay that political cost do occasionally appear. It would require a different kind of engagement with the Iranian people, support for civil society, for the women's rights movement, for the voices inside Iran who are risking their lives for a different future. That clearly distinguishes between the Islamic Republic and the Iranian nation. 70% of Iran's population was born after the revolution. They did not choose the Islamic Republic. They are living in it, and many of them are fighting against it at enormous personal cost. Their struggle deserves recognition and support. That does not take the form of bombs falling on their cities. None of this is guaranteed. None of this is probable given the current political dynamics. But the history of seemingly intractable conflicts contains enough examples of the seemingly impossible becoming possible to make despair premature. The Cold War ended without a nuclear exchange. The Good Friday Agreement ended a decades-long conflict in Northern Ireland. South Africa emerged from apartheid without the apocalyptic race war that many analysts considered inevitable. Nixon opened China. Sadat went to Jerusalem. Each of these moments seemed impossible until suddenly it was not. What those moments have in common without exception is that at least one leader on at least one side was willing to take a political risk for peace, was willing to see the enemy as a human being, with concerns that were not simply malicious, had the courage to say to their own people, "The path we are on leads somewhere terrible, and I am choosing a different path, even though it will cost me." That kind of leadership has been desperately scarce in the triangle of Iran, the United States and Israel. It has not been entirely absent. The Obama administration had it. Rouhani's team had something approaching it. Both were overwhelmed by forces on their own sides that found the conflict more useful than the peace. The world is watching. It has been watching for a long time. International opinion matters to elected officials in democracies. Regional stability matters to every country that sends goods through the Strait of Hormuz. The survival of the Iranian people matters to the diaspora communities in Los Angeles and London and Toronto and Berlin. Millions of people who fled the revolution and who have spent 40 years trying to bridge the gap between the country they left and the country that exiled them. The survival of the Israeli people matters to Jewish communities around the world, who see in Israel's existence not just a political fact but a historical necessity. The answer to a century of persecution that ended in the Holocaust, the possibility of Palestinian dignity, matters to more than 1 billion people who look at Gaza and see an injustice that poisons everything around it when left unaddressed. These are not separate threads. They are woven into the same fabric, with such complexity and such consequence that pulling on any one of them risks unraveling the whole. The Iran crisis is not just about Iran. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not just about Israelis and Palestinians. The American role in the Middle East is not just about American interests, narrowly defined. They are all one story. The story of whether human beings can manage the conflicts and resentments and ambitions and fears that accumulate over generations, or whether we are condemned to repeat them in ever more destructive forms until the repetition itself destroys us. The answer to that question is not written. It is being written right now. It is being written in the decisions being made in closed rooms in Tehran and Washington and Jerusalem by men who carry the weight of history on their shoulders and who will be judged by history on whether they found a way through or chose the fire. It is being written in the calculations of military planners, and the conversations of diplomats, and the protests of Iranian women, and the prayers of Israeli grandmothers, and the silence of Lebanese families in bomb shelters, and the exhausted determination of Yemeni children who have never known what peace tastes like. We are not standing on the brink of war as a metaphor. We may be standing on the brink of war as a fact. The mechanisms of escalation are in place. The weapons are pointed. The red lines have been drawn, and some of them have already been crossed. The diplomatic infrastructure has been eroded by decades of bad faith and missed chances. The international institutions that might have managed this crisis have been rendered useless by the great power rivalries they were supposed to prevent. The domestic political incentives in all three capitals tilt toward confrontation rather than compromise. And yet, history is full of the worst not happening, full of the phone call made at the last minute, the offer no one expected, the moment when the human desire not to die, not to watch your children die, proved stronger than ideology, or pride, or the merciless logic of deterrence. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which came closer to nuclear war than most people know, did not end in nuclear war. Not because of any master plan, not because of any system that guaranteed a safe outcome, because Kennedy and Khrushchev both, at the critical moment, looked at the off-ramp and chose it. The off-ramp exists here too. It exists in every crisis until the moment it does not. That courage, the courage to choose a future that does not end in fire, is the only thing standing between where we are and the worst version of what comes next. The question is whether anyone in any of the three capitals at the center of this story has enough of it. The question is whether the people of Iran and Israel and the United States, all of whom want, in the end, what every human being wants, safety and dignity, and a future for their children, can make their voices heard loudly enough, persistently enough, to create the political space for leaders to choose differently. The question is whether the world is watching closely enough and caring deeply enough to tip the balance towards survival rather than catastrophe. History is listening. The choice is still being made, but the clock is running, and the hands move fast.